في الشبكة إني أرحب بكم جميعا وأشكركم على تلبية هذه الدعوة اللي هي الاجتماع الثاني للجنة الاستشارية للبرنامج اللي بتخصص الشبكة للتعاطي مع موضوع الديون والضرائب. وهيدا يلي البرنامج، اهتمامنا بهذا البرنامج ينبع من انه الحقيقه موضوع الديون في الدول الناميه ان كان متوسطه الدخل او متدنيه الدخل عم تتحول الى تحديات كثير عميقه وصعبه، وبالتالي لها اثر مباشر او غير مباشر على قدره الدول على الايفاء بالتزاماتها تجاه الحقوق الاقتصاديه والاجتماعيه لشعوبها، وخاصه في القضايا اللي لها علاقه بالاهداف التنمويه واهداف التنميه. هيدا من ناحيه، ومن ناحيه ثانيه انه صار هذا الموضوع على المستوى الدولي وعلى المستوى الاقليمي والوطني قيد التداول، وفي كثير مسارات دوليه صارت عم تتناوله، ونحن بالشبكه عم نحاول نكون مواكبين. يعني اقله القمه قمه المستقبل التي انعقدت العام الماضي واللي صدر عنا بحدود 42 توصية للمتابعة، ركزت كثير على تمويل التنمية وتحديات تمويل التنمية والقدرة على تحقيق أهداف التنمية المستدامة. وبموضوع تمويل التنمية في كثير كومبوننتس مرتبطة بموضوع الديون. في قمة بدها تصير بيوليو القادم كمان حول تمويل التنمية، وفيها كثير قضايا حول موضوع الديون. وهذه القمة اللي الزيرو درافت صار عمليا بالتداول، اللي يفترض انه يصدر كديكلاريشن عن القمه، بيحكي على اعاده النظر بالمبادئ التوجيهيه اللي معتمده من قبل الامم المتحده بموضوع الديون، واللي بتحاول تساهم في معالجه الديون السياديه واستدامه الديون. ولكن ايضا في اقتراح انه ينعمل سجل ريجستري موحد عالمي لموضوع الديون لحتى تسهل عمليه التعاطي. ففي اقتراحات كثير حول هذا الموضوع. فانطلاقا من هذا ونحن بالاجتماع اللجنه الاستشاريه اللي انعقد السنه الماضيه الاول، حكينا على انه بهذا المسار بالنسبه لنا، خاصة انه على مستوى الامم المتحدة عم يتحكى كثير على الديت سوابينج، على تحويل الديون ونقلها من يعني ديون الى بموضوع تحول تغير المناخ وشراء التكنولوجيا والى هي. قلنا نحن انه هذه مسألة بدها نظر، اذا ما قلنا انه نحن بنرفضها، لانه اول شيء المشروطية باطار معالجة الديون مسألة مرفوضة، والموضوع الثاني هي قصة ماذا يعني بالتكنولوجيا النظيفة وكيفية استخدامها ونقلها. في قضايا كثيرة حول هذا الموضوع لن ندخل فيها الآن. اجتماعنا اليوم بده يكون مقسوم لجزئين. الجزء الأول بدنا نناقش دليلين تدريبيين قيد الإعداد. دليل تدريبي عم تشتغل عليه الزميله زينة عبلة واللي هو له علاقه بموضوع الديون، ودليل عم بيطوره زميلنا الدكتور نصر عبد الكريم من فلسطين حول موضوع الضرائب. هيدا الجانب الاول، وهيدا الجانب يعني الادله التدريبيه هي جزء من جهد يعمل على بناء قدرات خاصه للمجتمع المدني والفاعلين الحكوميين المعنيين بهذه القضايا، واللي بدنا نحاول انه يعني نصل نحن وياهم الى مش بس بناء قدرات، ولكن الى مقاربات ورؤى مشتركه او متشابهه في هذا المجال. اما الجزء الثاني هو اكثر حول ما يجري على المستوى الدولي، ان كان بموضوع الحكي على موضوع العدالة الضريبية، أو إن كان على موضوع يعني الحوار العالمي حول معالجة مسألة الديون. في معنى شنيان من شبكة العالم الثالث اللي بده يحكي شوي على الديون السيادية والجهود العالمية وما هي الريجوليشنز والرولز اللي عم تنعمل حول موضوع الديون السيادية. وفي معنى توماسو فاتشيو يلي بده يحكي شوي على موضوع العدالة الضريبية. فإذا القسم الأول هو أكثر له علاقة بالأدلة التدريبية، والقسم الثاني له علاقة بالحوارات الدولية حول موضوع العدالة الضريبية وحول موضوع الديون السيادية. فمرة ثانية برحب فيكم وبشكر حضوركم، وبعطي الكلام للزميلة مناري اللي لازم تيسر الجلسة الأولى.
شكرا زياد. مساء الخير للجميع. مثل ما قال زياد، يعني الجزء الأول من هذا الاجتماع هو للتداول في أدلة هي ما تزال قيد العمل والتطوير، يعني كجزء من ضمن استراتيجية الشبكة في بناء المعرفة حول قضايا الديون وحول قضايا العدالة الضريبية، بما يساعد يمكن في تعزيز المعرفة المعمقة على المستوى الإقليمي، وبما يساعد استراتيجيا في العمل على المستويات الوطنية من أجل الضغط يعني النهج التي يعني نتبناها. تعمل الشبكة مؤسسة زياد على دليلين. الدليل الأول خاص بموضوع الديون السيادية وبيجي من ضمن مشروع أصوات عربية من أجل تمويل تنموي تقدمي. هذا الدليل سيكون وثيقة أو أداة لسلسلة من الورش التي يعني تستهدف عدد من الخبراء من عدد من دول المنطقة، للأسف فقط 6 بالمرحلة الأولى، وسيليها أيضا ورش على المستويات الوطنية. نتعاون في هذا الصدد مع أستاذة زينة عبلة، هي باحثة ومستشارة مستقلة متخصصة بدراسات التنمية بلبنان والمنطقة العربية من أكثر من 20 عام. أستاذة عبلة اهتماماتها البحثية متنوعة، تشمل السياسات الاقتصادية والاجتماعية، قضايا النوع الاجتماعي، تحليل حساسية النزاع وأجندات التنمية العالمية، وهي تعاونت كمستشارة مع عدد من منظمات الأمم المتحدة والمنظمات الدولية، وطورت العديد من البحوث، وحاصلة على ماجستير في دراسات التنمية بكلية الدراسات الشرقية والأفريقية بجامعة لندن. الدليل الثاني اللي أيضا نحن فخورين بتقريره هو دليل سبق لشبكة المنظمات العربية طورته بالعام 2017، يستهدف منظمات المجتمع المدني في المنطقة وخاص بقضايا العدالة الضريبية. انطلاقا من الحاجة لأهمية تحديث هذا الدليل يعني في ضوء المتغيرات الحاصلة في مشهد العدالة الضريبية على المستوى الدولي وعلى المستوى الإقليمي، قررت الشبكة أن تشتغل على تحديث هذا الدليل، وفخورين بالتعاون في هذا السياق أيضا مع الدكتور نصر عبد الكريم اللي هو أستاذ العلوم المالية في كلية الدراسات العليا بالجامعة العربية الأمريكية في رام الله في فلسطين، وهو حاصل على شهادة الدكتوراه في الاقتصاد المالي ومن جامعات أمريكا والماجستير والبكالوريوس، وعمل ويعمل أيضا بجامعات فلسطينية مختلفة ويشغل عدة مناصب إدارية، وأيضا سبق له تطوير العديد من الأبحاث وأوراق السياسة. للأسف بسبب ضيق الوقت لن نستطيع أن نغوص في أطر ومحاور هذين الدليلين، ولكن الفرصة متاحة لكل من الخبيرين العزيزين، يعني فقط في 10 دقائق لكل خبير في استعراض الإطار العام للدليل. أكيد سيكون لنا محطات قادمة أكثر من الإطلاق. ببدأ معك أستاذ زين من 10 دقائق أن تؤثري لنا الإطار العام للدليل يعني عم تشتغل عليه.
اوكي، شكرا منار. ممكن انا رح اعمل شيرنج نعم سوري. اوكي، اول شيء انا كمان للاسف رح احكي بالانجليزي لانه استخدمت هذه اللغه للكتابه. So I will switch to English. I will present the the manual, the outline of the manual. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yes, it's okay.
Okay. So I will go actually immediately to the main sections. As Manar mentioned, this is a manual for civil society organizations for continuous training on the impact of public debt and the repercussions of public debt on economic and social rights and on sustainable development, with a focus on the 6 countries, Arab countries. And it is a primer, so it's a first kind of a manual, so it's first knowledge. It will cover basically the global landscape, discuss a little bit on the debt profile of the 6 Arab countries and the drivers of borrowing. It will also present the basic concepts behind public debt, how to decompose public debt, how is public debt related to other macroeconomic sectors, what are the indicators, the most commonly used indicators to assess public debt, and where can we find data. It will also present the debt sustainability analysis, mainly the 2 frameworks of the IMF, and the underlying logic of how they assess that dynamics, the concepts of liquidity and solvency, and it will present the different initiatives of debt relief that have been happening since the 90s, let's say. And finally, the main section, or the most important part, is how to readdress debt and reframe the discourse on public debt, taking into consideration the human rights lens, or the social and economic rights, particularly lens. And here I try to present different tools and approaches, like UNCTAD's, for example, framework, and alternative frameworks like the UNCTAD and the debt justice.
Are you switching PowerPoint slides, or we're still on the cover page?
Yes, I'm switching now. I just gave an overview. I wanted to give an
Because
overview.
it doesn't show that you're switching. It's still,
she's switching now.
Can you see now?
it's only the cover page that is showing.
And now? No?
Still.
Okay.
Time privilege.
I'll stop sharing and try sharing again.
Yeah, maybe share the full screen.
I'm sharing the full screen. Okay, I'll try. I think maybe it's slow. Let me, okay. Let's try. Anyway, so first I will present like an overview of the public debt indicators and conditions in the region, globally a little bit, but more in the region. And then maybe we will have profiles of the 6 Arab countries, their debt profile, and a bit of a narrative on the trend in terms of how public debt has been increasing. Okay, now, I don't know why it's not.
خلي تاخذها من هون. عندك اياه هذا البرزنتيشن.
Okay. It says moving now. Okay, and then the following section will present the different drivers for countries to borrow, external and internal. I list here the colonial legacies, the international system, financial system, international financial institutions, decision-making and bias, the economic policies of the US, for example, the recent interest rates, the geopolitics, external shocks, the absence of an international debt resolution system, and the increased reliance on the private creditors. And I also list some of the internal drivers, such as borrowing as a fiscal policy choice, for example, versus taxation. And here we can link to the manual on on taxation. Other reasons could be foreign currency liquidity management. Sometimes it's a political choice as well, irresponsible borrowing as well, and the national economy's structural feature. Going into the basic concepts of public debt, I tried to decompose debt and to show its different aspects by institutions, currencies, instruments, jurisdiction and maturity. And I tried to also make a connection with the macroeconomic sectors and using like the interest rates in terms of mechanism that connects public debt to different macroeconomic sectors. With the basic concept, of course, there's a big list of indicators on the public debt stock, as well as debt service indicators, financing indicators, balance of payments, gross financing needs, and the net transfers on external public debt, and 2 indicators related to social expenditures. I go into an explanation of these indicators and how useful they are. But in addition to the quantitative indicators, the manual tries to stress the political economy lens and raise a few questions that on, for example, who are the key actors behind the public debt? How is that redistributing resources? What are the institutions, laws, and policies, the local context, and how decisions for borrowing are made? There is a section that presents debt sustainability frameworks, the IMF 2 frameworks, and showing also their limitations in terms of prioritizing creditors over social and development goals, and also their over-optimism and their political bias sometimes. Underlying these debt frameworks, there's a logic of debt dynamic. Again, this is explained using the 3 variables related to growth, interest rates, and the primary fiscal balance to show how negative dynamics happen. And there's a brief also explanation on liquidity concepts. And there is a stress on addressing debt from a liquidity perspective, often less than a solvency perspective. The manual also presents different debt relief initiatives that happened since the 90s and explains the difference between debt restructuring, cancellation, rescheduling, and debt swaps. Now, going into reframing the debt issue and addressing human rights and social and economic rights, the foundation is the economic and social rights. And then there is a suggestion of different tools that can be used to add this rights-based lens, such as the guiding principles on human rights, for assessment of economic reform policies, human rights impact assessments, debt audits, different principles and guidelines either by UNCTAD, the UN, or even some by the civil society organizations that have been presented globally. And the 2 alternative frameworks to assess debt sustainability. One is the upcoming now UNCTAD Sustainable Development Financial Assessment Framework, and the approach that the Jubilee Debt Campaign or Debt Justice have been using. So I present also these as alternative frameworks because they link public debt to social and economic rights. The manual ends with a call to action on three goals or 3 strategic directions, let's say. One is making public debt concepts and data more accessible and to a wide audience. Two is reframing the problem of debt sustainability beyond the narrow financial perspective and more into a development issue and the rights-based issue. And three is to join international movements that are advocating for a different global system and a different financial architecture that is more just. This is it in short. The manual also tries to use example and cases from the 6 Arab countries. I would love to hear your feedback, ideas, comments on what needs to be more developed, stressed, what needs to be added. Thank you.
شكرا لدكتور نصر، وبعدها بنفتح نقاش مع حضراتكم. تفضل دكتور نصر.
تحياتي. شكرا. مسموع الصوت؟
مسموع، تفضل.
تمام. يعني وانا محظوظ ربما اكثر من الزميله عبله، لانه في دليل كان مطور سنه 2017، وهذا الدليل يعني كان في ذاك الوقت لا شك انه مرضي جهد كبير، لكن بعد المراجعه تبين انه ممكن بحاجه لتحديث، ممكن بحاجه لتطوير، ممكن بحاجه لاعاده صياغه في بعض المواقع، اعاده ترتيب. فهذا اللي الهدف من النهايه من تحديث الدليل هو يعني محاوله يعني دمج اجزاء جديده، استثناء اجزاء نشوف في العالم تطورات على موضوع العداله الضريبيه. هو زي ما قال زياد واظن عبله وانت حضرتك، بانه هذا الهدف هو تسليح الناس اللي بيناضلوا مشان العداله بمعرفه، وهذه المعرفة تكون كافية وفيها وعي لحول شو المطلوب مشان يحشدوا ويناصروا ويعملوا مناصرة لتعديل أو تطوير السياسة الضريبية بحيث تكون أكثر عدالة. هلا أنا عملت أوتلاين، بس للأسف أنا خارج البيت معيش الأوتلاين على اللابتوب أشاركه، بس موجود عند الأخ حسن، ولا أظن أنه بجوز بحاجة. هو صفحة بحاول أعرض الأوتلاين اللي أنا بشتغل عليه حالياً. بس ملاحظة لما نحكي عن ضرائب، أنتم عارفين أكثر مني بأنه هو المصدر الأساسي للتمويل في الدول في معظم الدول في العالم، إلا الدول الرائعية النفطية، يعني الدول اللي عندها خيرات، بس الباقي بيستند للضرائب. وبالتالي مشان يصير تمويل تقدمي حسب المشروع هذا والعنوان لازم تكون في عدالة، وبالتالي الضرائب لوحدها مش كافية. العدالة الضريبية هي تمويل تقدمي، وإلا بتصير تمويل رجعي إذا كانت مش عادلة وكان فيها ظلم للفئات المهمشة والأكثر فقرا. المحتويات الدليل بصراحة اللي بده يحواه، وهذا بحاول أكون بطيء أقرأ شوي مشان إذا حضراتكم وحضراتكن عندكم ملاحظات عليه. هو تقسم أو اللي بنشتغل عليه على 4 محاور أساسية. المحور الأول هو أساسيات في النظام الضريبي بشكل عام، وهذا أكثر مفاهيمي له علاقة بالمبادئ والقواعد والتعريفات، وبحوى على 5 أجزاء أساسية. الجزء الأول هو بتعلق بالسياسة المالية والموازنة العامة، لأنه لازم نتناول هذا الموضوع من جانبين الضرائب والنفقات، لأنه بتيجي الضرائب كسياسة هي في إطار هذا السياسة المالية، والموازنة العامة هي تعبير تنفيذي عن السياسة المالية للدولة، بالتالي لازم نحطها بهذا السياق. الثاني بيحكي عن مكونات النظام الضريبي، لأنه النظام الضريبي هو في سياسة بتخلق تشريع أو تطوير في التشريع أو تحديث في التشريع أو تغيير في التشريع، ومن ثم إدارة. وهذول الإدارة لا تقل أهمية عن التشريع، لأنه قد يكون في تشريع ممتاز وسياسة ممتازة، لكن إدارة النظام الضريبي اللي هي البيروقراطية الضريبية تكون سيئة، وبالتالي هذا بيفقد الموضوع مضمونه. الثالث هو تعريفات وأنواع الضرائب، يعني ماهية الضريبة، شيء أنواعها وعلى شو تفرض ومجالاتها. والرابع هي أهداف وقواعد فرض الضريبة ولماذا الضريبة. وهون في أهداف اقتصادية واجتماعية وأهداف مالية، وبيتم التعريج في خلال الأهداف. ملاحظات كانت من الزميل حسن حول المقترح بأنه ندرج علاقة هذه السياسة الضريبية والعدالة الضريبية بالتنمية وأهداف التنمية. سواء بالحد من الفقر، سواء بتحسين خدمات الصحة والتعليم. هذه الأهداف التنموية المستدامة، وبالتالي طبعا هذا من ضمن الأهداف الاقتصادية الاجتماعية للضريبة. هذا سيتم مراعاة ذلك. بعدين الآخر جزء اللي هو تحدثت عنه زينة، واللي هو الربط مع الدليل الأول، إنه الضرائب والدين العام. لأنه إذا الضرائب مصدر تمويل وكانت في عادلة، الافتراض بتقول إنه عدالة الضرائب بتجيب ضرائب أفضل، يعني أكبر، لأنه بصير في قناعة بهذه الضرائب. طبعا إذا توفرت البيئة السياسية والحوكمة الصحيحة، يعني بمعنى شعور الناس المكلفين بأن هذه الضرائب تعود عليهم بالنفع. إذا بتجيب ضرائب تمويل أكثر لخزينة السلطة أو الدولة، معناته بصير في الاعتماد على الدين العام كمصدر، يعني كملاذ أخير أقل، وهذا السبب في علاقة ما بينهم جدلية، والعكس صحيح. هذا أول باب من أبواب الدليل. الباب الثاني هو بيحكي عن العدالة الضريبية، بننتقل من أساسيات نظام الضريبة للعدالة الضريبية. وهنا بجاوب على بعض الأسئلة 4 أجزاء. هو ما المقصود بالعدالة الضريبية؟ وهذا سيتم الرجوع فيه إلى الأدبيات المتاحة. إنه سبق إنه كتبنا على الأقل أكثر من ورقة مع الشبكة حول العدالة الضريبية في العالم العربي، وهذا الدليل كمان حوى على بعض التعريفات، وبالتالي سنعتمد على هذه الأدبيات والتحديثات اللي صارت مفاهيم حتى على مستوى العالم، وصار الحديث عنه أكثر العدالة الضريبية مما كان في السابق. الموضوع الثاني هو الرابط بين العدالة الضريبية والعدالة الاجتماعية والاقتصادية. والموضوع الثالث، إمتى بتتحقق العدالة؟ شو المؤشرات للعدالة الضريبية؟ يعني كيمتى بنقول إنه في تحسن في منسوب العدالة الضريبية؟ هذا أظن بحاجة لبعض المقاييس وهنضيفها ونحددها وبعض المؤشرات. وبعدين آخر شيء نطلع على التحليل الضريبي من منظور النوع الاجتماعي. هلا هذا الموضوع الجندر تاكسيشن هو موضوع أظن كمان كتب فيه، ولكنه مش كتير في العالم العربي شائع أو يعني متحمسين له، وبالتالي ما لقاش نفس الاهتمام زي العدالة الضريبية. حتى العدالة الضريبية بالمناسبة يعني قليل ما كتب عنها، وربما الشبكة هي كانت المبادرة لهذا الموضوع. بس على كل الأحوال منظور النوع الاجتماعي مهم، لأنه في السياسة الضريبية أو التشريع الضريبي أو إدارة ضريبية إذا ما كان فيها يعني اعتبار لدمج ما يسمى بالاحتياجات المختلفة للذكور والإناث أو النساء والرجال أو الشباب والشابات، سميه ما شئت، بصير في ظلم، أو ربما يكون في ظلم مزدوج إذا غابت العدالة الضريبية أصلا in the first place، لأنه بصير في ظلم، فيش عدالة من حيث المبدأ، وبعدين بصير في ظلم للنساء. في أمثلة حول الموضوع وكتبنا ورقة للشبكة سابقا بيتم تحديثها على كل الأحوال. فهذا بصير في تحليل، لأنه ضروري جدا إنه العدالة الضريبية تكون عدالة شمولية، يعني بمعنى تشمل كل الأطراف، ما تكونش عدالة فقط يعني لنصف المجتمع أو ثلثين أو ربعه. وبالتالي هذا المنظور الاجتماعي بضيف للعدالة، يعني هو أحد تجليات العدالة الضريبية. المحور الثالث أو الباب الثالث لهذا الدليل هو عن تقييم العدالة الضريبية في المنطقة العربية. يعني زينة بلشت بالمدخل الدليل من نعطة يعني عن الدين العام العربي وتشخيص وبروفايل. أنا حبيت أعطيك الأول، ما بعرفش أنه أنسب، أنه أولا بنقيم العدالة الضريبية في المنطقة العربية بناء على هذه المفاهيم والأسس اللي حكيناها. بنعطي خصائص بيشمل 2 خصائص النظام الضريبي في المنطقة العربية يعني بشكل عام، شو الخصائص المشتركة، وإذا في استثناءات بنشررها طبعا. وهذا الثاني بنحكي عن منسوب العدالة الضريبية في المنطقة العربية، بنطبق المقاييس والمؤشرات اللي فوق اتفقنا عليها في الأساسيات والمفاهيم الكونسبت، يعني الكونسبتشوال فريم ورك، بنطبقه على منسوب العدالة الضريبية. بنقدم هيك رؤية حول يعني قديش في عدالة ضريبية وقديش بعيدة الحالة الضريبية عن العدالة، وبالتالي هذا بصير في تقييم المنطقة العربية بالمجمل. هلا آخر جزء الرابع هو تدخلات مقترحة المجتمع المدني في السياسة الضريبية. هون يعني زي actions needed، يعني بصراحة مشان نقدر نعرف وين نتدخل، في أي مجالات نتدخل، في أي نقطة من الزمن نتدخل، في التشريع نتدخل، في إقرار الموازنة نتدخل، فانه نوع من الضرائب بيكون التدخل اكثر يعني مفيدا. وهل نتدخل مع المشرعين، نتدخل مع الاحزاب السياسيه، نتدخل مع المجتمع المدني، ولا مع كلهم، ندخل مع المؤسسات الدوليه المؤثره. يعني وبالتالي يعني هذا هو اللي حنناقشه في الجزء الرابع. واخر شيء طبعا حيكون في نماذج مختاره من الانظمه الضريبيه في المنطقه العربيه، يعني زي حالات دراسيه اكثر تفصيلا. بعد ما نعطي بالمجمل خصائص الانظمه الضريبيه بالعالم العربي والمنطقه العربيه، ممكن نتناول 2 3 من الانظمه الضريبيه بالتفصيل في ملحق، وتكون كحالات تدريبيه، حالات دراسيه يتم تشخيصها اكثر للمشاركين في التدريب لما يصير في تدريب. وبالتالي ممكن نختار بعض النماذج اللي مختلفه مش متشابهه. يعني ناخذ نظام ضريبي افترض في المغرب، ونظام ضريبي ربما في فلسطين وربما في الأردن. يعني نشوف الأنظمة اللي شوي بتقدم فيها تباين، مشان الناس على الأقل تعرف هذه الأنظمة شو الفروقات بينها، وأني أقرب للعدالة، وكيف نخليها يعني نتقدم نحو العدالة من خلال هذه الحالات الدراسية. وبالتالي هذا هو في المجمل اللي بنشتغل عليه، قاعد أنا بطور فيه لدليل العدالة الضريبية. وأي ملاحظات يعني بنكون سعيدين في سماعها يعني. ويعطيكم العافية.
شكرا دكتور نصر، شكرا أستاذة زينة. يعني واضح أنه الدليلين رح يكونوا أدوات معرفية، ولكن غير مجردة عن المقاربات والرؤية النقدية للمسائل المتصلة بالديون والضرائب. ويعني نأمل أن يكونوا أدوات اشتغال لمنظمات المجتمع المدني في الفترة القادمة. المجال مفتوح لحضراتكم، معنا 15 دقيقة. للأسف كان مخطط أنه يكون معنا أكثر وقت، بس لازم نترك مجال لمحاور الاجتماع الأخرى في عنا أساسيين. 15 دقيقة لحضراتكم لتوصياتكم، أو يعني بناء على ما عرض من دكتور نصر وأستاذة زينة، شو هي توصياتكم للاتجاهات التي ينبغي تطوير الأدلة أو استكمال العمل على الأدلة عليها؟ تفضل. مبين عندي أستاذ أديب نعمة، تفضل.
شكرا. مرحبا جميعا، ومرحبا زينة ودكتور نصر، يعني اشتقنا لكم. الحقيقة أولا شكرا. أنا بعتقد الشيء اللي تقدم بالدليلين يعني مسألة إيجابية وتدعو إلى التفاؤل أنه عم ننتج مادة ممتازة جدا، يعني كما درجت العادة على كل حال، منه شيء مفاجئ. أنا رح أختصر وفوت دغري على بعض الملاحظات البونكتشوال بالنسبة للموضوع. بالنسبة للدليل اللي تبع الديون، لا أبدأ فيه. هلا واضح إنه في شيء عالمي، هيك نوع من يعني لمحة عالمية عن الأشياء، عن الجلوبال اللي سميتيها جلوبال. قد يكون هذا ملحوظ وقد لا يكون ملحوظ. منيح يبين بهذا الدليل أمثلة على الأزمات الكبرى، أزمات الديون الكبرى، سواء تبع الثمانينات 80 و 82، أو إذا في حالات تانية، من باب المعلومات ومن باب يعني إظهار الأثر. الفكرة الثانية، يعني أنا بخاف طبعا بدنا ناخذ 6 دول ونعمل لهم كيس ستدي مفصلة، وهذا أمر ممتاز جدا. لكن أنا بعتقد بأنه من الضروري لما ننتقل يعني بين الوضع العالمي ووضع الكيس ستدي 6 يكون في يعني لمحة كمان عامة عن المنطقة العربية بكاملها بالإحصاءات الأساسية، يعني يكون متوازن، ما يغيب هذا، يعني ما ننتقل من العالمي على هذا دون الشيء الإقليمي. وهذا أمر يعني بعتقد ضروري. فيما يتعلق بالمفردات والمصطلحات المستخدمة، أكثر مرة فكرة الديبت سستينابيليتي طبعا هي مطروحة وفي نقد لها، واضح الشيء اللي يعني، لكن أنا مع أحكي على المفردة نفسها. قد يكون من المناسب إذا بنقدر نطلع، لأنه السستينابيليتي الحقيقة يعني هي مصطلح الكونوتيشن تبعه بوزيتيف، فديبت سستينابيليتي يعني بصير بينفهم شغلة تانية. فيعني هل يا ترى ممكن ناخد شيء آخر، لأنه ما مقصود فيه السستينابيليتي اللي نحن عم نتداولها عادة، إنه sustainable development مش هو sustainable debt، شيء تاني. فهل يمكن نقدر ننحت يعني تجربة مصطلح تاني؟ فيما يتعلق بالضرائب، بهمني فكرة يعني ممكن كمان تكون ملحوظة، وبعتذر إذا ملحوظة، بس لما بنحكي عن الضرائب والنظام الضريبي بالتجربة التاريخية، لأنه نحن مجتمعات بيكرهوا الضرائب، نحن ما بنحب الضرائب، في حين الضرائب كانت هي الركيزة الأساسية اللي بنت تفوق المجتمعات الأوروبية بمرحلة ما بعد الثورة الصناعية وهلأ، وهي كانت عنصر بناء دولة قوية وعنصر بناء المواطنة. ففكرة دور الضريبة في نظرية المواطنة كمان هيدي مسألة يعني منيح تمرق، مش بس بالنظام الضريبي إلى آخره بالآخر.
بس الوقت أستاذ أديب إذا بتريد.
خلصت. بقترح إنه بالدليلين إذا أمكن يكون في، لأنه نحن هدفنا الاستخدام، يكون في إشارة أو حمل لينك للمصادر يلي من خلالها بيقدر أي شخص بعد سنة بعد سنتين يعمل أبديت للداتا والأمثلة يلي انعطت. فلازم نحط هاللينك هذا ليقدر يعمل أبديت ليقدر يستخدمه مشان يضل صالح الدليل. وأخيرا إذا مع الدليل يكون في 2 3 4 باوربوينت أساسيين كمان لتسهيل الاستخدام. عذرا.
شكرا أستاذ أديب. عندي أيضا طلب كلام من تشاينين. Welcome Chini. Okay, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much. I will just confine my comments to what was presented by Zaina. Thank you so much for a very great overview and very ambitious kind of coverage on so many different aspects of it. Just more specifically, I was just thinking in relation to the human rights approaches, apart from the Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, maybe to also consider the right to development. There might be another, it might open up another angle there. And then there's also the human rights special rapporteurs, one on foreign debt and human rights more specifically, and then the other on extreme poverty and human rights. I think they are also trying to kind of move the language and the jurisprudence around human rights in relation to debt issues. And then the other thing maybe to consider also, given that there are other kind of players in the space, especially from the commercial side, given the nature of the external debt, is to also to see whether there is opportunity in I think a convention also being kind of discussed around human rights and businesses, to include the asset managers, the credit rating agencies, as well as the primary dealers and things like that, right? In terms of being responsible lenders, and also how they conduct themselves when it comes to restructuring. And then the other point, I'm just thinking, given that a lot of the new debt that will be incurred, apart from financing existing ones, will be around kind of climate action. So that whole interface between climate finance and debt, which has obviously been attracting a lot of attention, could also be maybe contextualized in the Arab region and maybe in some of the countries you look at, given that at least for many developing countries, that would probably be their single driver behind, apart from apart from fiscal deficit spending, the other major expense would be around kind of climate action, right? And depending what kind of what happens in the multilateral space, and then how they do their own kind of just transition. And then another point would be around the issue of debt governance and management, especially at the national level. Different countries have different setup, and I think quite a bit of work has been done by different organizations like Commonwealth Secretariat, the parliamentarians, and to look at what should the kind of legal framework be in terms of who can issue debt, and then how is it monitored, and how do you deal with contingent liabilities and stuff like that. Might be actually an avenue in which local civil society groups can kind of take on and kind of question their policymakers and decision makers in their country, and without getting too technical on all the economics and financial aspects of it. Thanks.
Thank you. دكتور خليل تفضل.
شكرا. أنا بالحقيقة بدي هلا حبلش من حيث انتهى الاستاذ اديب نعمي. اول شيء سلامات استاذ اديب، اشتقنا لك. يعني نحن ما فينا نحكي عن هذا الموضوعين بدون ما نكون واضحين شو الماكرو ايكونوميك فريم ورك اللي عم نحكي من خلاله. اليوم ما فينا نحكي نحن عن عداله ضريبيه او ضرائب قبل ما نحكي عن النموذج الاقتصادي اللي من خلاله ضرائب قائمه، خصوصا في دول مثل ما تفضل دكتور نصر. عم نحكي عن دول ليس لا تعتمد على ايرادات من مصادر نفطيه. يعني هل نحن نتكلم عن ليش هذه الحكومات في هالست دول ذهبت اكثر الى الضرائب الغير المباشره؟ هل كما قيل في لبنان بعد 2001 و2002 عندما وضع الضريبه على القيمه المضافه انه اسهل للتحصيل، ام هو مرتبط بالسوشيال كونتراكت مثل ما كان عم بيحكي الاستاذ اديب؟ تحت على انه السوشيال كونتراكت اللي عم بيحكي عنه الاستاذ اديب انعمل اساسا على الانكم تاكس، ما انعمل على الاندايركت تاكس. واذا بنرجع لادبيات السوشيال كونتراكت تاكسيشن او ريبريزنتيشن it was about income tax. يعني في موضوع الضرائب بالنماذج دول عربية، يعني لبنان أكثر نموذج واضح في هذا الموضوع. موضوع الضرائب زيادتها هيدا عملية accounting exercise منه economic exercise، مبنية على الموازنة العامة. عنا هذا العدد من النفقات أو expenditures، كيف بدنا نجيب لهم أموال؟ قد ايه بنزيد ضريبه هون، بنزيد ضريبه هون، بنشيل هيك، بصير الموضوع اكاونتنج، لم يعد الموضوع اقتصادي وتداعياته بطلت حتى اقتصاديه. في هذه الدول ما هي الضرائب والتي تفيد النموذج الاقتصادي الذي يؤمن العداله الاجتماعيه ويقدم الديفلوبمنت لهذه الدول؟ في اسئله اكثر بالاقتصاد من ما هي بس هيومن رايتس او هي قصص لها علاقه، لانه هذا النقاش هو اكثر نقاش عم بيروح او حقوقي او عم بيروح اكاونتينج، ولكن بدنا نرجع له شويه اقتصاد له لروحيته الاساسيه. على موضوع الدات، انا بتمنى انه يكون كمان واضح مشكله الدات وعلاقته بالجفرننس ديفيسيت زينا. يعني دات له مرتبط ارتباط اساسي بالبرزيستنت ديفيسيت ان جفرننس اللي موجود بالليفانت وموجود بالمنطقه، وهيدا كمان اساسي لانه هو الدات مش كرمال مواضيع لها علاقه بالكابيتال اكسبندتشرز بس. يعني اذا بتاخذ النموذج اللبناني الدات واز كفرينج برايمري اكسبندتشرز، سو موضوع الجفرنس اساسي بموضوع الدين. بس انا حابب اسمع منك بس اشرحي لنا شوي فكره الاكسترنال برايفت كريديتورز، بس هيك لنقدر ناخذ فكره. لانه في نقطه ثانيه وهيدي بنهي فيها. what about the non-conventional creditors بالدول؟ يعني بلشنا نشوف مثلا غير دول مثل باكستان وسريلانكا في دور الكريديتورز الصينيين مثلا في هذا الاطار والمصارف الصينيه. طب في نون كونفنشنال كريديتورز، خصوصا انه مصر مثلا وغيرها من الدول اللي معقول تنضم للبريكس وكذا. بس نشرح اكثر فكره الاكسترنال كريديتورز وذا امباكت اوف يو اس بوليسيز، بس لانه هي ذا ايشو اوف انترست ريت بس، او في شيء ثاني قصدك فيها؟ بس لانه هو اللي ما انتبهت له. ثانك يو.
شكرا دكتور خليل. رح نعطيك زينب بالأخير الكلام. عندي بعد فقط مداخلتين، أستاذ وائل جمال ومن بعدها أستاذ أمين. ما بعرف أستاذ أنس كنت طالب الكلام، إذا بعدك طالب الكلام. أستاذ وائل تفضل.
مساء الخير. أنا هتكلم في بعض النقط السريعة. يعني أنا شايف إنه من الأهمية جدا الإشارة لفكرة مين بيملك الدين ومين بيستفيد منه ومين بيدفع ثمنه. وهنا في تداخل عميق ما بين الدين المحلي والدين الخارجي في الحقيقة، لأنه في احنا في مصر بنشوف ده بشكل واضح، إنه في استثمارات كثيفة وصلت 37 مليار دولار من الكاري تريدرز في الدين المحلي المصري، بسبب طبعا ارتفاع أسعار الفايدة اللي فوق 30% في اللحظة اللي احنا فيها. فهنا يعني ده شيء مهم جدا علشان نقدر نفهم أولا إزاي الدين بيتغير، والتذبذبات المتعلقة بشراء وبيع الديون. وثانيا لو بنفكر في الديت ريليف أو إعادة تفاوض أو إعادة الهيكلة. مهم جدا إن يبقى في هيكل واضح لمن يملك الدين، وهنا لا يقتصر الأمر فقط على الدين الخارجي. النقطة الثانية متعلقة بمراجعة الديون. مراجعة الديون دي كانت اقتراح قديم، اتطبق في حالتين في أمريكا اللاتينية في لحظات ما بعد تحولات سياسي كبير. من في حالة كان عبر رؤساء الرئيس، لجنة رئاسية، وفي حالة البرازيل في الإكوادور، وفي حالة البرازيل كانت عبر لجنة برلمانية. طبعا الإشارة لده شديدة الأهمية، لأنه دي بتبص على الاستدانة السابقة، الرصيد الدين المتراكم، وفيما أنفق من زاوية حقوق الإنسان، من زاوية الكفاءة الاقتصادية إلى آخره. وهنا برضو في أفتكر أنه مهم جدا برضو الدعوة المقرضين. الدين هو علاقة ما بين طرفين، الطرفين مسؤولين، مش بس الطرف المقترض. وبالتالي في تجربة حصلت في الصندوق السيادي النرويجي حوالين اوديتنج للقروض اللي هم ادوها، والاوديتنج ده يبقى معلن. فدي مسألة مهمة جدا، دفع بانه المقرضين كمان بالذات الدول والمؤسسات الدولية انها تعمل اوديتنج ل راحة القروض دي في الأهداف المطلوبة ولا لا. أنا طبعا بأشارك العزيز أديب في عدم تحمسه لفكرة استدامة الدين. أنا بشوف إنه يعني لفظ يعني مش دقيق وبيزقنا في حتة مش كويسة. وأنا يعني الفكرة اللي جات لي إن إحنا محتاجين ندور على ترم أولا ما يديش، مش كل الدين غلط ومش كل الدين سلبي، ودي أداة مهمة جدا في إيدين الدول علشان تحرك الاقتصاد، علشان تحقق التنمية، علشان تحقق العدالة الاجتماعية إلى آخره. وبالتالي احنا هنا بنتكلم عن كفاءة الاستدامة أكتر ما منها عن استدامة الدين، اللي هو تعبير بيدي انطباع ان احنا عايزينه يفضل للأبد، وان دي حاجة سلبية، كأنه بنستخدم نفس التعبير اللي بيستخدم على البيئة على الدين، وده حاجة مش مناسبة خالص في تقديري. آخر حاجة عايز أقولها متعلقة بالضرائب، إنه أنا أعتقد إنه من المهم جدا إنه يبقى في جزء حوالين أولا الأطروحات الضريبية الجديدة اللي بدأت من 2014 من أطروحة ضريبة عالمية على الثروة، اللي بدأت دلوقتي تاخد يعني قدر من الزخم، بالذات بعد ما تبنت البرازيل الأطروحة دي. وجزء كمان من الأهمية دي هي المفاوضات للإطار العالمي اللي هو الأمم المتحدة عن موضوع الضرائب. وهنا يعني الإشارة إلى المقترحات الجديدة المتعلقة بالضرائب. في مقترح مثلا بربط الضرائب الدخل بالفقر بشكل مباشر أو اللامساواة بشكل مباشر، على الأقل استعراض الطيف ده، وإذا كان قابل للتنفيذ في العالم العربي. شكرا جزيلا.
شكرا أستاذ وائل. بدي أنتقل سريعا أستاذ أمين، تفضل.
شكرا لكم. أولا لربما نحب نأكد أكثر على فكرة العلاقة العضوية اللي تنجم تكون بين المشروطية، خاصة المرتبطة بالتدين من قبل المؤسسات المالية العالمية والسياسات العمومية، إن كانت المالية أو الضريبية. والتجربة التونسية لربما كأخرى من التجارب معناها تبين ذلك بطريقة واضحة جدا فيما يخص التوجهات اللي تم إثارتها من تكثيف الضرائب على الاستهلاك، من إضعاف التصاعدية على مستوى جداول الضريبة على الدخل، أو من تراجع كبير على مستوى المساهمات الضريبية للقطاع الخاص إجمالا، أو تهميش الضرائب على رأس المال. هذه الكل في تونس طيلة 3 عقود منذ البرنامج الإصلاح الهيكلي، وأيضا البرامج اللي تم معناها إبرامها مع صندوق النقد الدولي بعد الانتقال السياسي في تونس سنة 2011، كانت الكل بالمشروطية تصب في اتجاه السياسات هذه. والعكس، وقت اللي تونس خذت نوع من المسافة مع صندوق النقد الدولي انطلاقا من 2023، شفنا أيضا بعض النفس التصاعدي، ولو بطبيعة الحال معناها الأمور ما هيش ثورية، لكن شفنا نفس تصاعدي ورجع أكثر بعد ما أخذنا مسافة مع المؤسسات المالية. هذا حبيت أيضا نحط الأمور في ربما إطار ما أوسع، وأدرك صعوبة المسألة تقنيا خاصة على مستوى الدليل المتعلق بالديون السيادية. يظهر لي أيضا الأمور هذه في علاقة ملتصقة بالإطار الاقتصادي والسياق اللي فيه برشا تحولات جيوسياسية حاليا، وتراجع لربما معناها المحور الغربي اجمالا شنو هي التداعيات اللي تنجم تكون على المنطقه متاعنا والمخاطر، لكن ايضا لربما الفرص اللي تفتحها. معناها هنا تحدثنا على البرازيل، تحدثنا على الاطار الاممي اللي كان مبادره من بلدان افريقيه وغيرها. اعتقد ايضا انه حتى اذا كان يكون فيه عناصر نتاع تحليل كيفي في الدليل هذا يكون مهم. شكرا.
شكرا. بدي انهي معك استاذ انس، تفضل.
شكرا أستاذة منار، شكرا للحضور الكريم المستقيم لهذه اللمة، شكرا لكل من سعى إلى تحقيقها. عندي ملاحظة على السريع، بشكل سريع، أن الموضوعين مرتبطين بطبيعة الحال بالإطار الأوسع اللي هو تمويل التنمية. إحدى المصادر التمويلات هي الضرائب والديون، وأعتقد لابد أن يكون انعكاس لهذا النقاش على مستوى مدى فعالية هذه التمويلات في التنمية على المستوى المحلي وعلى المستوى الإقليمي. النقطة الموالية بنفس الطريقة التي تحدثنا على إدارة الضرائب، سيكون من المفيد الحديث كذلك على إدارة مسألة إدارة الديون، وأعتقد هذه كذلك جزء من منظومة العمل المرتبطة بالديون. آخر نقطة هي الأزمات. تحدث قبل قليل الأستاذ أديب على الأزمات بشكل عام، ولكن أنا أود أن أشير إلى أو أن أثير الانتباه إلى الأزمات العارضة التي يكون لها أثر على التمويل والتي تستدعي اتخاذ قرارات سريعة. فمثل ما حدث مع كوفيد أو ما حدث مع غيرها من الأزمات التي تضطر فيها الإدارات إلى اتخاذ إما عن طريق الديون أو عن طريق الضرائب سياسات استثنائية، وهذه السياسات الاستثنائية لا تأخذ بعين الاعتبار لا الإطار لا حكامة ولا كذلك استشارة بعض الأطراف المعنية بمثل المؤسسات المنتخبة. فأعتقد كذلك التركيز على هذه النقطتين. وشكرا، وهناك كثير من النقاط وردت سابقا وأنا أعززها. شكرا لك.
شكرا لكل المتدخلين. استاذة زينة ودكتور نصر، يعني أي إضافات بناء على كل ما تم اقتراحه أو التوصي به قبل أن ننتقل للقسم الثاني؟ تفضل استاذة زينة.
شكرا على كل الإضافات اللي انطرحت والأفكار. يعني معظمها باخدها بعين الاعتبار طبعا. هلا هو يعني الموضوع كتير متشعب وكبير، يعني ما بعرف قد ايه فينا نحط كل شيء بهذا اول دليل على الموضوع هيدا، بس رح اجرب اخذ اكثر ما فيه. موضوع debt sustainability as a term اكيد هو فيه connotation اساسا انه الديت لازم يضله sustainable، انه بضلنا نمشي فيها بالدوامه. فهو يعني ذاته ايه فيه معنى مخفي بقلبه. بموضوع اكيد بموضوع الازمات الكبرى فينا نزيد هالامثله، وخصوصا مثل ما قال استاذ انس اخر شيء هلا. كمان على UN Special Reporters ممكن نشير لهم شيء. هلا بموضوع الديت governance وهي entry point للcivil society، الموضوع كمان هذا واسع ومشعب، ولكن يمكن it is interesting نزيده. الاكسترنال كريديتورز اللي عم بعني فيه هن البرايفت كريديتورز، يعني الاستدانه من الاسواق الماليه، اليورو بونز، اللي هن ما بقى معروفين مين هن بيكونوا، مين حاملين السندات بيصيروا، واللي عندهم اكثر واكثر، واللي هن عندهم فوائد تجاريه، فوائد الاسواق يعني. ايه بعتقد هذا كل شيء. الاكزامبل تبع نوروي موجود لانه كتير انترستينج، مزبوط. وشكرا على كل الاضافات. بعتقد
شكرا استاذ زينة. شكرا دكتور نصر.
يعني ملاحظات سريعة، مش هطول، بالعكس الملاحظات كانت اللي قيلت very relevant يعني للموضوع. الضرائب والمواطنة يعني بإشارة لها تمام في الدليل، ولو أني بعرف يعني على الأقل قناعتي أن المواطنة أشمل بكثير من موضوع الضرائب، يعني مش بالضرائب وحده هي تحقق المواطنة، والمواطنة أظن إذا تحققت هي بتجيب الضرائب ومش العكس يعني. وبالتالي ممكن الإشارة له هذه العلاقة الجدلية بينهم. والباقي الملاحظات أظن والتيكن، يعني دكتور خليل بيحكي عن النموذج الاقتصادي صحيح. طبعا كل الموضوع مبني على دور الدولة ودور القطاع الخاص وعلى النماذج المعتمدة في العالم، الليبرالية الاقتصادية الاجتماعية وغيرها. وبالتالي يعني هي أكثر نموذج كنموذج اقتصادي أكثر من كونها تفرقة اللي حضرتك قلت لها أنه في دول نفطية ريعية ودول أخرى. لا، يعني المقصود أنه السياسة الضريبية هي نتاج توازنات قوى في النهاية. في شيء اسمه مش بس الاقتصاد الكلي اللي بتحكم السياسة الضريبية، لا، هو المناخ السياسي العام. يعني هي في النهاية توازنات قوى ومراكز قوى في مصالح بدافعوا عنها ناس، وبالتالي إذا غاب الإطار السياسي، إذا بدك تروح أبعد من الإطار الاقتصادي الكلي السليم، بنتجش لا اقتصاد كلي متوازن ولا بنتج سياسة ضريبية أصلا عادلة. وبالتالي هو المشكلة بالعالم العربي مش بالنظام الضريبي، هذا موضوع فني، هو أظن مشكلة أعمق بكثير من هيك. بس على كل الأحوال يعني أتفق معك أنه بالإشارة إلى هذا الموضوع الأستاذ وائل جمال في هناك في الدليل يعني إشارة للطروحات في الآونة الأخيرة الدولية فيما يتعلق بالعدالة والمبادرات اللي بتتم، بنشر لها هذه طبعا أنا قرأتها. والباقي شكرا لملاحظاتكم يعني والتيكن.
شكرا يعني شكرا للجميع على التفاعل بالقسم الأول من هذا الاجتماع. بدي انتقل وأعطي الحديث أستاذ ربيع نصر، مدير المركز السوري لبحوث السياسات، الذي سيتولى مشكورا إدارة النقاش والحوار في القسم الثاني، الذي يعني سيؤطر أو يعني سيتناول كل موضوع الحوار العالمي حول الديون السيادية. تفضل أستاذ ربيع.
شكرا جزيلا ومساء الخير جميعا. أنا رح أحكي بالإنجليزي بالأول لأعرف على المتحدث الرئيسي، وبعدين بنشوف حسب النقاش إذا لازم أحكي إنجليزي ولا الإنجليزي ولا عربي. تمام؟ الجلسة الثانية مخصصة للحديث على I will switch to English. It's about the key themes of the global dialogue on sovereign debt. So it will take mainly on the dialogue on debt sustainability, including the call for establishing a UN framework agreement on sovereign debt. Our main panelist, Mr. Go Chen-yin, I hope that I pronounce it in the right way, is a senior policy advisor with the Third World Network, focusing on finance and development. Previously, he advised developing countries on WTO trade talks and trade agreement in Geneva. He founded Asia 360 News and Asia Current Affairs magazine with a team across 15 countries, and later held roles as a chief editor and the chief technology officer for Group Research Department of DBS Bank. You are very welcome, Mr. Chen-yin, and please, if you can keep the presentation within 15 minutes to open the discussion later. Thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you so much, Mr. Nasser. Thank you so much for having me here. It's actually the run-up to the Chinese New Year of the snake. And this is Chinese New Year's Eve, so there's been some preparations around for the New Year here in Singapore. So I was hoping that I could be perhaps a little bit more coherent with the presentation, but due to a lack of time, I managed to put some slides together, which I would like to share with you. Primarily looking at what are some of the key developments in the sovereign debt space very broadly, I mean, there are many things that have happened, but I've kind of chosen a selection of what I think to be the most kind of salient developments that civil societies are interested in, as well as what are kind of confronting, developing countries that are, facing debt distress or are going through debt defaults. And then what are some of the implications for other countries that may unfortunately find themselves in that situation, or at least learn from them to try to avert some of these. So that's largely the focus. And like to thank again Zaina so much for sharing with us what she has in mind for the training manual, which actually kind of covers probably quite a fair bit of what I'm going to talk about. Perhaps in my case, I'll just kind of give you a little bit more detail around a contemporary situation in terms of what kind of transpired over the year in 2024, and then maybe some opportunities in 2025 that can advance this issue to the benefit of developing countries. So let me just kind of go through the slides, which will probably be an easier way of doing it, since like I said, I'm not terribly, I doubt I'll be terribly coherent with this. I don't know whether, can you see my screen? Yeah, and let me switch to presentation mode. Okay. And okay, just to start off with, right? I mean, global debt as a whole, both for developing and developed countries, has reached something like 3 times the global GDP, right? And this is all kinds of debt, right? I mean, borrowing from banks, it includes your household debt, everybody, right? So roughly, is kind of unprecedented level, as you can see. Important to take note of that is actually if there's any kind of systemic risk coming from a very overblown debt levels, will probably be coming more from developed countries rather than developing countries, because they are the ones that have very high debt to GDP levels, both in some European countries as well in the United States, as all of us are probably quite familiar with. So, but as far as developing country debt, I doubt it will kind of create kind of systemic global risk in terms of, from a kind of financial standpoint. It might spill over and manifest itself at regional levels if countries then kind of fall into default and distress, as we have seen in some countries like Kenya, Sri Lanka earlier 2 years ago, where the country kind of basically imploded and led to a political collapse, right? As they were unable to meet their debt obligations. So not so much as some systemic, probably national, maybe regional, if things are really get kind of out of hand. Partly the reason is because, like I said, out of that global debt, the bulk out of their overall global debt, I mean, about a third of that is actually sovereign debt. And like I said, the bulk of it is actually held by developed countries rather than developing countries. And within developing countries, China obviously owns the lion's share of them. The larger emerging countries, emerging markets would be the biggest kind of issuers and holders of public debt in that sense, right? But obviously, this is a very high level picture. As you kind of get more granular, you kind of see that within different regions, even for the Arab regions, they're clear between the oil importing and the oil exporting countries. The debt level then becomes quite different and nuanced as you kind of go into the more detailed picture. So this is the kind of rough picture as we get towards 2024. I mean, there was a spike in which everybody knows in relation to the COVID lockdown. Countries are kind of recovering from that very high debt to GDP ratio as growth kind of resumed as the lockdown ended. But in African region, growth is still anemic. And as a result, as a region as a whole, again, there might be differences between different countries. The debt to GDP ratio is still kind of inching forward, whereas in other regions, you kind of see them tipping down. Again, like I said, this is a very kind of macro picture. And as a result of, and one of the side effects of that, right, given the very high debt to GDP ratio, given the kind of risky, the perception of high risk in relation to many of these countries in the region, their cost of borrowing has also kind of gone up to reflect that lack of confidence in these economies, right? Which then kind of compounds the whole problem about refinancing their debt and how sustainable that is, right? So generally across the board, again, giving a macro picture, emerging markets tend to have a higher borrowing cost compared to developed countries, and for African countries, they kind of bear the brunt and also the most extreme manifestation of this higher cost, right? Unfortunately. And given that there are still a fair number of countries that has this fairly high debt to GDP ratio, a lot of the resources that obviously is kind of spent spent kind of paying interest payments and servicing their debt. And then I think for quite a number of countries, they have repayment of the principal coming in from 2024, 2025, and then all the way to 2030. Quite a number of those debt will be maturing, and then they probably have to, again, raise money to kind of pay for it or to roll over the debt, which in an environment where they don't have great risk ratings, so it will be expensive for them to go back to the market to try to do that. And in some cases, they are unable to do so. And the reason why I'm saying all this is because it kind of gives a context to some of the solutions or the supposed solutions that we've been hearing about, in some of the different kind of calls from different corners of the world, asking or at least demanding for changes, demanding for debt resolution or debt relief, or to enhance other kind of multilateral debt relief measures like the common framework and things like that, right? So just a very quick snapshot. Again, I didn't really kind of do justice to the details of the region, but just very quickly, you know, for the region, as you can see, there are quite a number of countries that falls into this bucket where the debt to GDP ratio is above 60%, and you guys are probably quite familiar with it, and I think it's already been touched on. A lot of it seems to be driven by kind of fiscal spending or financing your fiscal deficit, and you guys are probably more familiar with the details in terms of who the debt is owed to, you know, who the creditors are, and then what kind of coupon and interest payments are being made. So at least it seems like quite a number of countries in the region are kind of, especially the oil importing countries, are kind of facing a bit of a kind of debt sustainability crunch, right? So again, like I said, very quick kind of snapshot on and some context. And to that extent, some of the Arab countries also reflect the same kind of challenges. So again, as I mentioned, to that context, you know, there are various kind of solutions that has been kind of proposed either multilaterally or from the regions. And I just kind of run through them a few very quickly that, like I said, has kind of captured some media attention, or at least some attention in the so-called debt or sovereign debt world, right? So there's increasing talk about state contingent debt instruments, essentially, you know, it's actually some event-based, right? So the most obvious example would be whenever there is a hurricane or some kind of natural calamity, then it will just automatically kind of trigger a debt suspension, right? And then the other kind of increasingly as well, especially in restructuring the debt or in rolling over with new issuances, what seems to be fairly increasingly popular in a way would be to link to economic performances. So El Salvador is a kind of weird extreme example, but the recent restructuring for the Sri Lankan debt that concluded late last year in December, basically also imposed a bunch of conditions around if the country did well economically, then they will pay more back to the creditors, right? And whether they do well or they don't do so well, a lot of it depends on the way the debt sustainability assessment is being kind of framed, right? So actually that was a key sticking point that led to why the debt restructuring in Sri Lanka took such a long time, because the creditors refused to accept the debt sustainability assessment of the IMF, saying that it is too pessimistic, and therefore they didn't want to accept that, right? Because that means that there will be a larger debt relief, and that will also mean that the way subsequent payments to the new debt will how would I say they will not get as much back, given how the assessment by the IMF on Sri Lanka meant, right? I mean, it's very complicated, but the long and short of it was the Sri Lankan government and the creditors were fighting, and in a sense, they wanted a more optimistic outlook from the IMF, and it had the impact on the debt sustainability assessment, so that will allow them more returns when the economy did well, so to speak, right? So these would be, I mean, we kind of see this kind of emerging as one kind of particular feature in the restructuring negotiations on debt restructuring, and also in new instruments that are being kind of issued. And then the other thing that has become very popular, especially over the last few years, is this debt for nature swaps, which I'm sure you guys have heard a lot about, especially in all these different multilateral discussions. And it has kind of changed in character, I think, qualitatively. As you can see from this graph, in the past, they were kind of small, they are kind of episodic. But over the last couple of years, actually, these debt for nature swaps have become a lot larger, and they've become more frequent. And for countries that are kind of shut out from the capital markets, this might be a instrument for them to kind of get back into the market, because these instruments are rated differently from the sovereign rating, right? So if I have a low sovereign rating like CCC or something, some of these swaps are actually rated at a higher rating, so that it can kind of, get back to the international market to then raise funds for, right? So that's why there's some kind of interest around debt for nature swaps, and they have, like I said, they become bigger, and they have also, and this is just like, some examples. These are some instances, or probably all the instances I could find in 2024, and then there will be more and bigger ones that are kind of, anticipated for 2025. And because they are bigger, they have also become more complex. In the past, it was fairly straightforward, but now it's increasingly moving to the right hand of the screen. And then and there's a kind of very active push by certain conservation NGOs as well as multilateral development banks to push this particular structure, because they think that it works, and it also allows these multilateral banks to basically leverage their loan book. So they provide some kind of credit enhancement by kind of guaranteeing the debt, so that it has a lower rating. It is investors are then able to pick it up, and then when that happens, they will then offload their guarantee maybe to a private insurer, which you see here, up here at number 7, right? So this Development Finance Corporation kind of selling it, their guarantee to reinsurers. So it's just getting very, very complex. And this seems to be a trend that's kind of moving in that direction, right? So anyway, these are some of the new players in it, and all that. And it's been touted as a solution to some of the debt problems that developing countries face, especially in climate finance and in biodiversity. Although we think it's kind of suspect, and I think it's only probably usable to a small number of countries. And like I said, it's very complex instruments, and many of the obvious beneficiaries are actually the primary dealers themselves, the banks like UBS and Goldman Sachs, Citi, especially after Credit Suisse that kind of pioneered this debt for nature swap was acquired by UBS, right? They kind of ran into trouble, and then they disappeared, and then but other banks have come in to fill that space, right? So they're looking for new kind of natural assets or biodiversity assets or whatever you can kind of swap it with, and you can see the active interest in that space, which is kind of facilitated by conservation NGOs that are already in that space. So you're probably gonna see more of these kind of stuff being pushed as some kind of solution to climate action as well as debt problems for developing countries. And then just very quickly, so on debt sustainability, there's also been increasing criticism around it, especially I think Zainab mentioned there are two frameworks from the IMF. The one for low-income countries in particular has been kind of receiving a lot more criticism, even from the World Bank chief economist itself. Just to kind of flag it here, I won't go into the details of which, but basically there are all kinds of technical problems with it. There's political issues with it in terms of the bias of IMF itself being a creditor. And then also there's confusion over how the DSA is being used. Are you using it for early warning or are you using it for restructuring, right? So they're quite different purposes, but it's kind of like the same model. And then obviously, you know, people have issues with it, as I've kind of highlighted or alluded to in relation to the restructuring process for Sri Lanka. And these are just some proposals out there by different groups, academics, policy think tanks, and all that to basically reform the DSA. And this one in particular talks about how DSA should also be reformed to take into consideration all these climate issues, because it will entail a lot more, you know, financing, and what does it mean in terms of the different scenarios and stuff like that. But again, I'll just kind of flag it here. We can talk more about it later. And then finally, there are all these different initiatives that are being kind of pushed out there from different regions. So there's the Bridgetown initiative from Barbados. The French have pushed something. The Germans have pushed something. There's the G20, V20, and then there's this Summit for the Future, all leading up to on this journey to the Financing for Development conference in Spain later the year. And one big topic around that is obviously this reform of international financial architecture. And that is a very broad church in which there are multiple different proposals. Like I said, it includes debt for nature swaps. It will include state contingent clauses, as I mentioned earlier as well. And then obviously there are also people pushing for sovereign debt restructure mechanism or things like that, right? So under this broader umbrella of international financial architecture reform, that's pushed by different corners and multilaterally, there'll be the devil's in the detail in that sense. So there are many different things that are being pushed for. That then kind of and then another development which I think we should kind of pay attention to as well is in the public international law front, where there is an ICJ opinion around this whole issue about climate change and the state's obligations around that. So for many developing countries, especially the small island developing states, they have been pushing this argument in their submissions around climate change and debt, and how debt has to be dealt with effectively at the multilateral level in order for developing countries to be able to take a serious chance at dealing and managing climate change. So again, an important development, I think, in which we'll establish at least some kind of legal norms around this issue, and definitely arguments in which many countries are making. And then very quickly, this is the UN Framework Convention on Sovereign Debt that's currently being pushed for by a number of civil society groups, by Eurodebt, Oxfam, and others that you're probably familiar with, and it's something I think you guys are looking at. I think on the whole, I mean, it makes sense. I think, you know, we're all for it in terms of how they have kind of identified a framework and dealings with some of the most excessive parts of and expressions of what happens when countries get into debt distress, the push for a human rights perspective. Quite several points that Zaina has mentioned in the training manual are kind of captured here in the Framework Convention. Obviously, whether it will kind of get more traction, how to go about getting that, something up for discussion. And that's it. I don't know what it's there's something of interest. I was kind of doing research around this sovereign bond issuance. Again, I just want to raise a point around in the case of Israel, they have also been very actively raising bonds to fund their war effort in Gaza, and they have issued roughly about 8 billion. No, actually more than that. About maybe close to 10 billion since the war started in October 7, 2023. They have raised externally something like close to 10 billion, not domestically, okay? So these are international issuances, primarily in the United States. And it's a problem because potentially this is in contravention of the ICJ opinion on the occupied Palestinian territory issued in July last year, and potentially, obviously, in contravention of the upcoming case on genocide that the ICJ is looking at, right? So anyway, the numbers are here. These are the
Sorry,
states in.
if we can
Yeah.
wrap up.
Anyway.
If we can
Yeah.
wrap up in
Okay.
2 minutes, please.
Okay. I just want to flag that issue.
Yeah.
Just to kind of consider how debt is also used for more nefarious purposes. Thank you. That's it.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's a very rich
Thanks.
presentation and with many ideas. So I will open the floor in the next 15 minutes for a discussion. So please, if you have any comments or questions. Maybe I can just start with one issue which is related to the region. I think I can give 2 examples about Syria. For me, the Yemen numbers is shocking, but I think the countries within the conflict is having a lot of gaps in the registering the debt, especially in Yemen. Where we have two de facto governments. But in Syria, before the collapse of Soviet Union, we didn't register many of the military debt at that time. After the collapse of Soviet Union, we just jumped to 150% of the GDP because it was not registered. And I believe many of the military deals that it's and loans, it's not probably in a proper way registered in these countries, which make the hidden debt is a huge burden, which is not part of these indicators as well. I don't know how to manage this, how to measure this. We try to estimate in a proxy way from different indicators these kind of debt, but I think this is a burden that it's happening in the region. The second point also related to the hidden quote unquote debt, that the abuse of power between regional and the global actors with the countries in the region. So they have like a political support for countries like Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, etc. And because of this like political umbrella or support, they take over a huge part of the economic opportunities within the country. So it looks like a debt on the country, but it's not an official debt. It's an influence debt, quote unquote. So I don't know if you can talk a little bit about this, how this can affect the debt cost in reality. And yes, can also collect any comments from the colleagues.
I have one quick question, Rabia.
Please.
On the Israeli Eurobonds or sovereign bonds that they issued, what interest rates do they carry? Like regular market rates?
Okay.
Just quickly, so they have 2 types. they have this thing called the Israeli bonds. Unfortunately, the terminology is very confusing. It's called Israeli bonds, but it's also the name of the organization that issues them. And they are a special entity under the Israeli Ministry of Finance that is registered with the US Securities Commission. And they issue, in effect, some kind of diaspora bond in nature. And that actually has a slightly better yield than a better interest than your US treasuries. And then the Israeli government itself also issues sovereign bonds, sovereign euro bonds, and that's to international, and they raise that internationally. So that I think I think that is roughly about. Hang on, it's in my notes somewhere. I think that is about. I think that's 4 point something coupon. Hang on now. Where is it?
It's okay.
Blah, blah. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
okay. I was
So
thinking about the other ones.
yeah. So I think for their 2025 issuance this year, given the way the credit default spreads are, as well as the current yield, which has come down since the ceasefire, it will probably be still on the higher than normal side. And also they have lost a fair bit of international investors around it because of because obviously especially the more conscientious one at least are stepping away from some of these Israeli issued, or at least issued by the Israeli government bonds, and as a result the market has shrank a little bit for them. But as I understand, they were in London not so long ago in January, in the beginning of the year, and there was they were speaking to private primary dealers, like Citibank was there, potential investors, and they were so there's no real mention of a specific amount, but they're definitely still trying to do that. So last year they issued $8 billion through this specific process, which is the largest single issuance by the Israeli government as far as I know. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Now Hassan and then Anas.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Shen and Rabia. And also I want to reiterate Happy Chinese New Year. I know it's very late in Singapore. It's almost midnight, I suppose. So thank you for being here with us. Right. My question is about, so on the global conversation about debt in the global south, it's very much preoccupied with the binary of whether it's a solvency crisis or it's a liquidity crunch. And then most of the discussions are as follows. According to most multilateral development banks, international financial institutions, such as the IMF, for instance, that there's no debt crisis in the global south, let alone in the Middle East and North Africa. This is what they say. Now, and the reason what they say, the argument that they give is that countries are able to pay back their debt. So there's no problem. There's no debt crisis. Maybe with some liquidity injection, they should be fine. Now, my question is, do you agree with the premises behind this question, that is, it's a solvency versus liquidity crunch debate? And if it's that case, if it's this way, then what do you think is the way to get out for global South countries?
I think there's a strictly technical way to answer this, I suppose, right? And I think in some cases it will be very obvious, arguably like the case of Ethiopia and arguably the case of Ghana before they defaulted. So, already other people looking at the numbers could tell that it was actually unsustainable. The IMF was unable to call it in their Article 4 consultation DSA. They were kind of late in calling it. And then you could argue, maybe that could be geopolitical or all this kind of stuff, right? But I think like I said, some would be obvious. I mean, if you already have, like, I don't know, say 80-90% debt to GDP ratio, you have a fiscal deficit trajectory in which you can't close because of some structural issues, and your growth rate is low, and you have a big current account deficit, which means that you're a net borrower. I mean, I'm just saying all these things kind of points to saying that, look, it's just not gonna be possible, right? And if you want to just call it a liquidity problem, so you can kind of kick the can down the road so that you can get some injection so that you can pay out the creditors, you know, things like that, or have less of a haircut, or to kind of roll it over with some kind of debt for nature swap, whatever the case might be, right? I think the numbers technically, there'll be those obvious ones, okay? Then the not so obvious ones, I think that's where, and it's not trying to be disingenuous, because I think is what are you looking at, right? In terms of your frame, are you looking at the realization of SDGs? Are you looking at being resilient against imminent climate threats? Are you talking about realizing, you know, some of your basic obligations from a human rights perspective in terms of right to food, to housing, and things like that? And which means that there is a certain need to prioritize these expenditure before, you know, paying off your creditors, arguably, right? I mean, not arguably, I mean, for sure. I mean, in a morally sane universe, that's what you would do, right? I mean, it's simple, right? If I were running a deficit, I mean, if I own money to loan shark and I need to feed my baby, I mean, it's very clear, I need to feed my baby. I mean, the loan shark will just have to wait his turn, right? You can kill me, then you get nothing. But my baby comes first, right? I can't make that compromise. Doesn't make sense. So I think if we use that more, if we kind of strengthen, like from this perspective, these are absolute kind of needs and priorities that goes towards the very existential kind of needs of the people, then to me that takes order, right? And I think one could make a very sane, logical, rational, database, evidence-based kind of arguments for that, right? And if you're unable to meet that, then you have a solvency problem, which means that the debt just needs to be cut. Maybe not, I don't know, 70%, but maybe 30% or whatever the case might be, right? So I think to push that narrative, to push that perspective, I think is extremely important. So that so that the rights of the creditors do not trump, you know, the rights of people to simply just survive and have a chance in that sense for survival, right? So I would say that would be first and foremost. Apart from the technical, I mean, there will be some countries where clearly, you know, from just the numbers, it just adds up to like you will have a crisis at some point, you know.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
I'm not sure, Anas?
Thank you. Thank you for this presentation. Just one question. I'm sorry if I didn't get the question I would like to ask due to some disconnections. It's about especially the strategy of exchanging some debts towards investments. This strategy was developed by the past, and don't know if it was assessed and to evaluate at what level it's a good strategy, and at what level it could be a strategy defended or advocated by the civil society organizations.
Okay. Sorry, Anas, can you reframe the question? I didn't fully understand it.
Yeah, it's about the to exchange debts towards versus investments at national
debt
level.
swaps.
Yeah.
Oh, debt swaps. Okay. 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 Yeah. Shall I just reply? I think if how would I put the debt swaps that are at least kind of, you know, as I mentioned, kind of more frequent these days is around debt for nature swaps. Of course, I think there's increasing interest because of the success of some of these instruments that they're expanding it to other areas as well, right? So they're talking about debt for development swaps, right? So the World Bank put out a document last year called Debt to Development Swap, and then basically how you can, instead of conservation, you could have certain kind of social goals instead, right? So achieving certain, a standard in health or education or whatever other developmental outcome that might be. So there is a push towards that. I mean, my question would be, who would be interested in that? Because as far as Western investors are concerned, there seem to be some appetite and interest around tortoises and rhinos and giraffes and stuff like that, right? And general kind of environmental kind of either conservation or some kind of green objective. Towards health, saving babies, less so, for whatever reason, right? So I'm not sure who would who will it appeal to? And because if you look at some of the ESG kind of funds, for instance, I mean, they're very, very skewed towards the E. They're not so like, S and G so much, right? Except for very extreme cases in which, some of them have offloaded Israeli kind of investments in that sense. So to me, it's not, maybe there is, I'm not saying there isn't, there might be. So then that could be a viable kind of instrument for a social and economic outcome that I think are important to the global south in that sense. But I'm not sure, or at least I'm not familiar with there might be some small examples here and there. Now, more generally, in terms of investment, I'm not sure. I don't know whether you refer to the Egyptian case where there's something like that going on. I'm not familiar, and I think ultimately it really depends on the terms, right? It depends on the terms. It depends on whether the financial who owns the instrument and what kind of benefits are they getting back from the instrument, right? So if there's some kind of investment and basically it's like some kind of reverse debt, it's something like a debt to equity kind of swap, right?
Yeah.
So you basically kind of say, okay, if you do well, then it's kind of like I will then get the return on a particular investment that is kind of paid upfront by what is owed to me, right? So I really whether it's good or not, I think it boils down to the details of the terms in that sense, rather than the instrument themselves.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. محمد رمضان تفضل.
Thank you, Chief, for your presentation. I have a question on the was what you can call the resurgence of the trade war between China and the US in the coming and its effects on inflation, on global inflation, on global trade. What could you expect regarding to the emerging market debt volumes, especially with the expectations that the Fed will not go downturn on interest rates. So now I think today Egypt has returned to the international debt market. Now it had like 2 billion in euro bonds with a coupon which is very 9.7 to 10 for a 5 to 8 year period. I think this does not reflect the current global economic status or the current liquidity in the global market. What could you expect regarding that, especially for the global south?
I wish I know I'll be a billionaire if I do. I think that's $1 million question in everybody's minds, right? But I think, like you said, the sense is that the Fed is not gonna. I mean, the U.S. central bank is not gonna cut. It's not gonna cut the rates. It's gonna probably stay longer for higher, or at least at the current rates, right? I think the market is not anticipating any, cuts this year. And the risk would then be, will it even go higher? But in any case, the current environment at the current rate, or even with the anticipated like 25, percentage point, 25 points cut in the interest rate. I mean, it's still very, very high, I think, for developing countries, and also the quantum of what they actually owe, right? So, and then also in the environment where the US dollar is also fairly strong, although it's kind of dipped a little over the last few days. But, you know, I mean, given that there's a kind of explicit policy of the current administration to kind of maintain it at high levels, it will, in my mind, kind of compound the debt problems and the repayment problems of many developing countries, right? Yeah, and that will also have a ripple effect on how much interest there might be in domestic bond issuances, especially in the local currency, given that if that's going to be the situation in the US, with fairly high interest rate, strongish dollar, you know, whether there will be kind of for a lot of foreign participation in the domestic debt markets of many emerging kind of economies, that might not be as strong as in previous years, and the anticipation that actually rates will start coming down, right? So I think in the case of Indonesia, you already see a bit of contraction, and then the central bank has to kind of raise interest rates. So I think that is kind of symptomatic of the larger kind of middle size developing countries, and then for the smaller ones, they will continue to face this crunch, and they would be kind of a little shut out from the market, either because it will be too expensive, and this debt for nature swap would be an appealing option for them to try to do that. I mean, it seems to be the maybe the harsh reality of how things might play out, you know. But anyways, and it's really anybody's guess, I suppose.
Great. Thank you very much. Do you have anything to add at the end?
Thank you.
We are close to the end of the session. Mr. Chen, do you have anything to add?
No. Thank you so much for.
Thank you for all the insights. Back to you, my colleagues.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Xian. Thank you very much, ربيع. هيك مسموع؟
تمام.
اوكي. طيب رح ننتقل لاخر جلسه، رح ننقل للغه العربيه. رح ننتقل لاخر جلسه حول الضرائب. بهيدي الجلسه مثل ما ذكر اول شيء سي زياد، رح نناقش بعض المحاور الرئيسيه بسياق الحوار العالمي حول مواضيع تتعلق بالقواعد الضريبية، تتعلق بالإصلاحات المطلوبة. فبهيدي الجلسة رح نقدر نناقش سوا الأولويات الاستراتيجية، يعني رح يتم عرض القواعد الضريبية والإصلاحات المطلوبة على المستوى الدولي، ومن ثم هيدي رح يتسنى لنا مناقشة الأولويات الاستراتيجية على مستوى المنطقة. يعني بمعنى آخر، كيف ممكن نحن كشبكة أو يعني شركاء للشبكة أو منظمات مجتمع مدني على مستوى المنطقة، كيف فينا نتموضع بإطار هذا الخطاب العالمي حول مسألة القواعد الضريبية، طبعا من يعني منطلق المنطقة. فبتمنى أنه هيدي النقاشات تكون فرصة لتعميق الفهم حول يعني النظم الضريبية الأكثر العدالة والأكثر شمولية بالمنطقة وبالعالم. المتحدث الرئيسي بهيدي الجلسة هو اسمه توماسو فاتشيو، هو رئيس أمانة اللجنة المستقلة لإصلاح الضرائب الدولية على الشركات إكريكت. وبشكل عام لجنة إكريكت بتهدف للمساهمة بإصلاح القواعد الضريبية الدولية من منظور المصلحة العالمية أي الدولية وليس المصلحة الوطنية، وبتسعى لإيجاد حلول ضريبية عادلة وفعالة ومستدامة للتنمية. توماسو كمان هو محاضر بالمحاسبة بكلية إدارة الأعمال بجامعة نوتنغهام بالمملكة المتحدة، وهو كمان محاسب قانوني معتمد، واهتماماته البحثية بتشمل المعاهدات الضريبية، التهرب الضريبي وغيرها من القضايا. من دون إطالة، توماسو المنبر إلك. I think you're on mute, Thomas. We cannot hear you.
Hi, thank you so much. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you so much for the invite and to be able to participate in this important event. I've been asked to provide an outline of some recent development in international taxation and international taxation cooperation between countries. I think we are in a inflection point in terms of international cooperation. For a number of years, the international tax cooperations has been led by the OECD through the G20 OECD Inclusive Framework Forum that delivered in 2021 a two-pillar solution to try and attempt to fix tax avoidance by multinationals. But since then, the legitimacy of that two-pillar solution has been questioned, and also its implementation appears to be struggling. One of the reasons why that 2021 two-pillar solution has not been seen as a success by many commentators, because it was basically driven by rich countries, G7 countries predominantly, and didn't reflect the interest of developing countries. As a result, so the two-pillar solution, just to briefly, included a minimum tax on multinationals and also a new way to allocate the profits of multinational between countries. The pillar one, the allocation of profits between countries, that was supposed to allocate a small share of the profits of multinationals to different countries based on a formula and based on, by reference to how much turnover they had in those countries. Has now been stalled, as it requires the US ratification for this to be implemented. And Trump has signaled last week, in his first few days as president, the new president of the United States, that he rejects this two-pillar solution agreed by a previous administration under the OECD Inclusive Framework. Regardless of that, the minimum tax, which is the second pillar, has now been implemented by more than 50 countries. These are mainly the European Union and other G20 OECD countries. However, the implementation of the minimum tax by G7 and the OECD countries means that this will affect a number of tax incentives in your region, because it will effectively enable rich countries to collect tax, then the tax profits that the countries in your region offer multinationals up to the 15%, which is the minimum rate. So it is important for countries in your region to think about protecting the tax base as a result, to consider the implementation of minimum taxes. They don't necessarily have to follow the OECD Pillar 2 solution, but they can be developed to reflect the needs of that of each individual country. The other, as I said, the Pillar 1, which is basically a solution to tax the multinationals' profits, particularly digital companies, but not just digital companies, or largest and most profitable multinational in the world, is now stalled. That means the country should consider implementing digital service taxes or other unilateral measures, such as withholding taxes, to ensure that the digital giants pay their fair share in the region. Not many countries in Africa and the Middle East have introduced digital service taxes, but a few have done in Europe. Nigeria have done in Africa. A lot of countries participated in the OECD Inclusive Framework negotiations, and we're kind of waiting to see whether that negotiation would have delivered an outcome, but it's clear now that that outcome will not be delivered. And so digital multinational in particular, are still not paying taxes or a fair share of taxes in the region. And so there should be a coordinated discussion on how to ensure that they pay a fair share of taxes, and evaluating different options such as digital service taxes or withholding taxes. Most importantly, the fact that there was a lot of discontent with the OECD Inclusive Framework G20 solution meant that the African group pushed for a new negotiation, new multilateral process at the UN that is starting this year to be fully negotiated. It has been put forward through a number of resolutions that have been voted in the last 2 years, and these have been approved, but with the opposition of, by a large majority, but with the opposition of G7 countries and some OECD countries. The region has voted largely in support of this process, if not totally in support of the process. So this is a really important process because it can actually be the first time that we have an inclusive, that means all countries in the world will participate in this negotiation, transparent, so as a lot of the negotiation can be actually be seen, they're web streamed, and therefore we can make the negotiators accountable, something that could not happen within the OECD inclusive framework. And this negotiation will start in a few days. There will be an organizational session, and what they already decided to negotiate will be a alternative to Pillar 1. So they will negotiate something that is called a protocol on cross-border services, so how to tax cross-border services. They will also negotiate the text of the framework convention, and it will also negotiate another early protocol. So early protocol is like a policy measure, such as the cross-border services, that will look at to create a policy outcome, policy solution for a specific problem. And there might be issues there that could be addressed, such as illicit financial flows or taxation of rich individual, ultra net worth individuals. One of the reasons why there is an emphasis on taxation of rich individuals, because last year the G20 put forward this global agenda through Brazil, who had indicated that we should put a minimum tax also, as we did for multinationals, also on the super rich. And this is something that it is gathering momentum, in particularly, and when we've seen how the extreme concentration of wealth is putting at risk and democracy and the fabric of our society. And so this issue is expected to be perhaps picked up as one of the second protocol. The other protocol is a protocol potentially on illicit financial flows. This is something that the African group have pushed for and advocated over the years. Illicit financial flows present a big drain of resources in Africa. And so it is possible that a protocol on illicit financial flows could be picked as the second protocol at the UN. The other thing is that there are a number of other multilateral processes that will advance or potentially give us the opportunity to advance international tax cooperation. One is the Financial for Development Conference, which I think was mentioned in the previous session. Tax is not the main priority, but it will be discussed. It would expect it to be part of the final negotiated text, and it is an opportunity to. So a lot of people see the Finance for Development Conference as an opportunity to create momentum around the UN framework, Convention on International Tax Cooperation, trying to reduce the opposition to this process. At the moment, the US, the UK, France, Germany are clearly opposing to this process, and we need to. Whilst we need South-South solidarity, so we need a strong Latin America group to support the African Union, your region, Asia, to all come together and be strong, have a strong common voice. At the same time, we need to reduce the power of the blockers, and so that's something that it will affect this balance of whether we can persuade the blockers to engage more constructively in the negotiation, something that will affect the outcome, the legitimacy of the negotiation, the legitimacy of the output of the negotiation, and its ultimate implementation. The other two processes are the G20 in South Africa. This is the first time that South Africa and an African country has the presidency of the G20, and the issue of international tax cooperation will be discussed. And again, that can be a forum where some of these challenges in finding consensus can be negotiated, and an opportunity to try and reduce the opposition to the UN process. And finally, there's the COP at the end of the year, where discussion around how to finance a just transition, finance the the resources that are required for countries to adapt and face climate change will also be center stage. Hope you found this helpful. Happy to take questions and as you see fit.
Thank you very much, Tommaso, for the presentation. رح أفتح المجال الأسئلة والنقاش، فيلي عنده أو عندها أي سؤال يا ريت بيتفضلوا برفع اليد أو بالتدخل مباشرة. ممكن بحال لأنه بعد ما في حدا ممكن أنا أبدأ بسؤال أو باستفسار بهذا الإطار. اليوم عم نسمع كثير عن الإطار الدولي للأمم المتحدة من ناحية العدالة الضريبية، بس اليوم في كثير قضايا بعدها بتصير المخاوف، يعني ما بعرف إذا توصلنا لحلول لها سواء على مستوى المنطقة أو على المستوى الدولي. يعني مثلا بظل العولمة والتطورات التكنولوجية بشكل أو بوتيرة كثير سريعة، اليوم عم نسمع بكثير تقنيات جديدة مثلا مثل يعني الذكاء الاصطناعي، البلوك تشين تكنولوجي، العملات الرقمية. هيدي كيف ممكن مقاربتها من ناحية عدالة ضريبية أو عدالة اجتماعية؟ هل في أي دور، يعني هل في أي إطار لمعالجتها على مستوى الإطار الأمم المتحدة؟ يعني ما بعرف إذا تم التطرق لها يمكن من وجهة نظر عمل لجنة إكريكت. كيف هيدي القضايا ممكن نقربها اليوم بإطار العدالة الضريبية؟
Thank you. I think there are things that should be done now, and there are things that will take time to be delivered. This is about protecting, generating domestic resources and ensuring that the international tax system facilitates that. So there are issues such as transparency, where we've seen quite a lot of progress on exchange of information between countries. We see on financial accounts. And so the question is how much countries are using the data that they receive. Are all countries participating in automatic exchange of information? Because that requires creating some infrastructure at national level. And are they implementing beneficial ownership register at national level? So I think it is shown that the exchange of information and making transparency in terms of wealth ownership as increases allow the countries to generate additional revenues from low-income countries to rich countries. So this applies to everybody. And perhaps for low-income countries, this can be low-emerging countries. This can be one of the low-hanging fruit. The other solution is around taxation of digital companies. I think that it is something that the countries should consider straight away. I think the issue there is one of potential retaliation by the US, but many countries have shown that the question of retaliation is one of the trade-offs that they need to consider, but that doesn't mean that necessarily they will not introduce unilateral measures. Nigeria has successfully introduced equivalent to a digital service tax, so there's no reason why other countries, and the more countries do that in a coordinated manner, the lower the chances of US retaliation. The other is the minimum tax. I think there's the pressure now, so there's definitely an incentive for countries to ensure that all multinationals pay a level of minimum tax in all the countries in the region. So when there were tax incentives, these will no longer work. So the question is, are countries in the region collect that tax on the profits, or will the tax be collected in the European Union, in Switzerland, in the US? And so this is something that can be legislated those are the digital service tax, the minimum tax on profit multinational, those are things that can be legislated relatively easy. I'm saying they're not super easy. They require some work from the tax administrations and getting it through Parliament, but there's now sufficient mass of countries that have done it, so there are clearly opportunities to learn from experiences of similar countries. So this is something that should be done this year in terms of actually trying to get countries to generate revenues and to protect their tax base. The other is engagement with the UN process. The countries that have put forward themselves in the region to be as part of the bureau of this new negotiating process will be Egypt, Nigeria, Kenya, and Senegal. And so there's those four countries, Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, and Egypt. So those four countries will be sitting in the negotiating table in the bureau of the Framework Convention. So it's important. So the region is A, well represented, and B, they are represented by countries that already actively taken a strong role in international tax cooperation. Particularly the previous phase of the Framework Convention was led by Rami Youssef, who was Deputy Minister of Finance within the Egyptian government, and so the fact that Egypt is coming back to be part of the bureau is also positive. But there is little participation by a number of other countries. So I think one key role of actors in the region is to bring them together, build awareness, and build support from this process at national level in all of the countries in the region.
شكرا توماسو. رح نروح لعند الأستاذ أحمد عوض.
مساء الخير جميعا. يعني بجوز سؤالي مرتبط بمداخلة السيد توماسو ومداخلة السيد شنيا اللي متعلقة بالديون. احنا كحركات ومؤسسات مجتمع مدني حقيقة بعيدا عن التحليل العميق اللي بيتم بقضايا الدين وأسبابها وكيفية معالجتها والضرائب وكيفية معالجتها، وفي خاصة في الدول اللي عندها دين عالي ونظم ضريبية هشة أو غير عادلة، يدور حوار دائما، وهذا الحوار حقيقة يعني ما في اتفاق عليه حول كيف بدنا نعالج هذا الموضوع. بعض الحلول اللي بتنطرح أحيانا بتحدث عن إلغاء الدين على سبيل المثال، أو إلغاء بعضه، أو تبديله باستثمارات، أو توزيع حقوق سحب خاصة الSDRs من قبل صندوق النقد الدولي للدول الأكثر بشكل أكثر عدالة. في موضوع الضرائب بينطرح موضوع من سنوات طويلة حول الضرائب الرأسمالية. قديش في العالم هذه السيناريوهات أو هذه المقترحات قابلة للتطبيق في ظل هذا الاستحواذ الكبير لصناع أو العلاقات الوثيقة بين صناع السياسات على المستوى الدولي وخاصة الاقتصادية وبين كبار رجال الأعمال ممكن يتأثروا بشكل كبير من إجراء إصلاحات عميقة في النظم الضريبية في العالم. انتبهت أنا حسن.
بتحب توماسو بتحب تاخد هلا تجاوب على سؤال احمد، او بناخد ما في غيره؟ لكن اوكي بنروح للجواب لاحمد، بعدين بنرجع بنشوف اذا في اسئله اخرى.
So I'm not a debt expert, but what I see is that there is a clear interlink between the two, debt and tax. One of the reasons why countries struggle to repay their debt, and the fact that they spend so much share of the GDP in debt repayments, is also because they're not unable to collect revenues for those that have the broader shoulders. So focusing on being able to raise domestic revenue, it's paramount to be able to be in a stronger position to then face debt volatility and repayment of debt, because you can't. I mean, it's almost like that countries in the region and a number of other low-income, middle-income countries are cannot attacked under a double whammy of incredibly high interest rates on their debt, even if their debt is only a fraction of what rich countries have. And then on the other hand, they suffer for tax avoidance and tax evasion by multinational and the richest individuals in the country. And so we need to tackle both. And in my presentation, I suggested some ways that countries can start building a solution to increase domestic resource mobilization, which will then ease pressure on debt repayment and debt restructuring. Hope that makes sense.
شكرا توماسو. رح أسأل أنا سؤال بحال لأنه بعد ما في حدا بده يتدخل، فبهالوقت إذا بتحبوا تحضروا الأسئلة أو أي تعليقات هذا هو الوقت. أنا رح عندي سؤال بسيط لتوماسو. قد يبدو سؤالي على منحى أنه one size fits all، ولكن باعتقادك أو من وجهة نظر إكريكت، إذا حبينا نقول إنه في 3 قضايا أو 3 إصلاحات رئيسية اليوم تعني الجنوب، دول الجنوب العالمي، عم نحكي مش طبعا أنا يعني واثق إنه شغل إكريكت هو معني أكثر بالإصلاحات على المستوى العالمي ليس على المستوى الوطني، ولكن إذا شئنا أنه ناخذ كسامبل كعينة دول الجنوب العالمي، شو فينا نقول إنه أهم 3 يعني 3 قضايا تتعلق بالإصلاح الضريبي اليوم عم بيتم التركيز عليها، سواء بالمحادثات على مستوى الجي 77 أو على مستوى منظمات المجتمع المدني إلى آخره.
I think you need to look at the incentives and what other countries are doing that can provide a benchmark for what can be politically viable in the country. So what we've seen recently is a number of countries, low-income countries, that set up task forces to tax high-rich wealthy individuals. This is a fairly recent development, but all the evidence suggests that in terms of money generated compared to investment, this is a good use of public resources. i.e. you spend some money to set up a group of tax authorities, tax officials, then specifically look at the individuals and how to tax them, and you get quite a lot of return for it. And there is guidance now from the UN provided on how to tax wealth at national level, including model legislations. So also considering how to strengthen taxation of wealth, because in many countries, wealth is under tax. And so this is an area where further work can be done, and it shows that when work is done, where focus is given this area, it's a priority. It generates resources. The other is the incentive of minimum tax. I mean, all business ministers, trade investment ministers love giving tax incentives. That's their power. Somebody goes, there's a visit from another country, investor, and they say yes, which they shake hands and they give a tax incentive. So, but now it's usually very difficult to push back and say, well, this tax incentive doesn't work. Can we repeal it? And usually you just get pushback and they say, well, the multinationals still want this incentive. If you take away this incentive, they run away. But now with the minimum tax, the incentive trade-off balance is different. Now, the multinational knows that if they pay taxes, say, in Lebanon, they will pay tax on the same profits in the UK or in Germany. And so for the multinational, it makes no difference. And so Lebanon or another country in the region can raise the minimum tax and should suffer lower opposition to make this, to collect this additional source of revenue. So I think there's a number of, for each political solution, there are some trade-offs, and the political path from an idea to turn into a legislation is very difficult. And so, but these are 2 areas where there is enough suggestions and evidence that there could be advanced, relatively easy because of the changes in the way that multinationals are taxed and the recent focus from a number of countries on taxation of the rich.
واضح. شكرا كثير توماسو. ربيع.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just want to also to raise this issue. Like a lot of this debt in the south, or this remarkable increase, is caused by the COVID pandemic. So can we think about like reassess the burden of the pandemic and to tax the developed countries to pay their share in this regard? Because I think we forget about that the burden of the pandemic distributed in an unequal way between the north and the south. So can we think about such a thing? This is the first point. And the second point, which is related to this, is that in the pandemic, many companies, like the oil companies, created like exceptional profits. Many developed countries want to negotiate with China to participate, for example, in the Environment Fund, but we don't have a negotiation with the oil companies, the transnational ones, to pay taxes that to redistribute this burden of the pandemic. So just I'm trying to see if we can think something that related to the structural issues that caused the debt that we have now.
اوكي. انا بقترح انه ناخذ بعد اخر سؤال للاستاذ امين بوزيان، وبعدين توماسو بيقدر يجاوب عن الاثنين.
شكرا حسن. أنا ماذا بيا في نفس السياق بوست كوفيد. فما أيضا الحرب أو اجتياح روسيا للأراضي الأوكرانية اللي أعتقد أيضا كانت صدمة خارجية كبيرة لبعض من البلدان المنطقة. نحن في تونس مثلا معناها في حالة تبعية غذائية وين نوردوا 50% من حاجياتنا الغذائية مرتبطة أساسا معناها على مستوى الحبوب بروسيا وبأوكرانيا. اعتقد انه السياق هذايا افكتيفمون معناها على مستوى دابور دولي شفنا حتى من اكثر المؤسسات النيوليبراليه على راس الصندوق او الجهاز التنفيذي للاتحاد الاوروبي الكوميسيون اللي دعاوا مثلا لضريبه على الثروه الكبرى، اللي دعاوا ايضا لضريبه حول المرابيح الخارقه العاده للشركات اللي اتت بالازمات هذيا. واعتقد من اكثر الجوانب اللي صار فيه هو كبيرة بين دول الشمال ودول الجنوب في السياق هذا بالتحديد، أنه دول الشمال عطت لنفسها نوعا ما الحصرية أنها تعمل سياسات نوعا ما كينزية. وهذا اللي بطبيعة الحال شفنا المؤسسات المالية العالمية في تفاوضها مع عديد دول الجنوب باقي تفرض في وصفات تقشفية كبيرة جدا. لا أدري كيف حاولت نشارك معكم الريفليكسيون التفكير هذايا فقط. مش عارف إلى أي مدى نجم إلى ليمونت المداخلة. أشكر برشا توماسو على التقديم المفيد جدا نتاعو.
شكرا جزيلا أمين. توماسو المنبر لك، ومن بعدك بنختم الجلسة.
Thank you for both questions. I think we are in a moment where there is very little solidarity. I mean, I live in the UK and I'm Italian, so I can kind of just talk on the countries that I'm more familiar with. But the idea that countries in Europe are going to all of a sudden become generous towards the global south is not one that is very worthwhile. It's not likely in this at the moment, and unlikely to in the short term to change, given the way that the US are positioning itself in terms of being America first, and so each country there's a lot of pressure to not help other countries, nor putting money into global funds. And so I think the issue of on making rich countries consider cancelling debt or restructure debt because countries in the global south were more severely hit. Whilst I agree entirely on the principle, I think politically is very difficult to navigate, and so it will require a strong argument and strong narrative and strong campaigning and strong lobbying for that to work. I mean, we are in the Jubilee year, so in terms of everything can happen on that, and I hope that things improve on that front. I think what was mentioned was around windfall taxes. So I think that is something that also that country should consider. It was something that the EU and a number of other countries introduced as a result of the increase in both on result of increase of margin profits or commodities as a result of the Ukraine-Russia conflict, and also on the increased interest rates and banks. And I think that's what banks made significantly higher profits than the historic average, and they were able therefore to put forward this solution to generate some revenues. I have to say with mixed results. So I think in terms of the question of are we right to tax windfall profits, where the windfall profits, that was a battle of the ideas that was won in Europe and in other countries, but actually turning that into a legislation that raises significant amount of revenues, there were many loopholes that were exploited, so that the revenue that was collected was not as much as hoped. But this is something that, I mean, I'm not familiar with in terms of the export prices in many of countries in the region, in many commodities, but those that, there might be opportunities where windfall profit taxes should be introduced or evaluated, both on export, but also on if the significant companies that make significant profits that are importing and selling goods into those countries. I just wanted to say the one country that this is Colombia, that I'm quite familiar with the tax reform that was put through in 2022. So they included a number of windfall taxes on different exports, and so that was suffered little criticism in terms of the pushback was fairly limited, and I think so that's another area where countries can consider introducing windfall profit taxes to tax those high profits that are significantly above what the average profit would have been in that industry.
شكرا كثير توماسو. طيب رح أعطي بس ننتقل للملاحظات الختامية ومن ثم نختم الجلسة. أول شغلة شكرا على هذا النقاش القيم. هاي النقاشات ربما بتساهم بالإعداد لمحطات قادمة أساسية على المستوى الدولي من زاوية خاصة التمويل من أجل التنمية، مسار التمويل من أجل التنمية، لا سيما المؤتمر الرابع FFD4 يلي حيصير بسنة 2025 بإسبانيا، اللي هو مؤتمر الرابع لتمويل التنمية. وهيدا هدفه أنه معالجة الفجوات التمويلية المتزايدة سواء بالمنطقة ولا على مستوى العالم بشكل عام، لأنه اليوم بالمنطقة العربية حوالي 14 دولة ما حققت أي هدف من أهداف التنمية المستدامة حتى اليوم. وفي يعني بعض النقاشات على مستوى لجنة الأمم المتحدة لغرب آسيا الأسكوا إنه قد ربما المنطقة بحاجة لل 2060 لحتى تحقق أهداف التنمية المستدامة. فمن هون بيجي أهمية خاصة لمسألة التمويل من أجل التنمية. مسألة إعادة توزيع الضرائب، إعادة توزيع الموارد المحلية أو الضرائب، أو مسألة يعني النظر في معالجة قضايا التنامي المديونية بالمنطقة أو بالعالم تقع في صلب هيدا المسار تمويل التنمية. هذا الاجتماع بده يترتب عنه شغلتين مثل ما ذكرنا. بده يترتب عنه أول شيء مساهمة بتطوير الدليلين حول الديون السيادية والعدالة الضريبية من جهة، والمساهمة الثانية هي بتحديد الأولويات الاستراتيجية لعمل الشبكة وشركائها بمنظمات المجتمع المدني بالمنطقة على قضايا الديون السيادية وقضايا العدالة الضريبية. يعني بتمنى أنه يكون هذا النقاش ساهم ب يعني يعطي شوية فيتشرز، مؤشرات حول شو هي الأهداف الاستراتيجية لعمل الشبكة وشركائها على مستوى الديون والضرائب. رح نوفيكم بجهود الشبكة بهذا الإطار لكي يتم تأطير هذه الجهود بإطار المسارات الدولية القائمة بهذا الموضوع. فبدنا نشكركم مجددا على حضوركم بهذا النقاش.